Good evening, and welcome to our first in-person event in something like 2.5 years. Thank you for coming out for it. My name is Thad Ziolkowski, and I'm the Associate Director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, which was founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in 2007. As always, I would like to thank Shelby for her steadfast support of the Biography Center. It's her vision that makes this program possible. Each year we offer 5 $72,000 biography fellowships, and I'd like to welcome the fellows for 2022-2023. Nicholas Forster for a biography in progress of Bill Gunn, Tatiana Brailovskaya, the Levy Sloan Fellow, who's at work on a biography of oceanographer Henry Bigelow, Jane Kamensky, who is writing about Candida Royale, Avi Steinberg for his biography of Grace Paley, and Krithika Veriger for her group biography of the princesses Duleep Singh. We are also affiliated with the innovative Master's Program in Biography and Memoir, or BAM, and I'd like to welcome the incoming class of BAM students. Our next event will be Jean Andrew Jarrett discussing his new biography of the poet Paul Laurence Dunbar with Carrie Greenidge. This is on Friday, October 7th, 7 p.m. on a Zoom webinar. And just after that, on Tuesday, October 11th, right here in the handsome Elebash Recital Hall at 6:30 p.m., Andrew Meyer on the Morgenthau dynasty in conversation with Kai Bird, our Pulitzer Prize winning director. Please mark your calendars and register for these free events on the Leon Levy website. But tonight we are here to celebrate Mark Rozzo's Everybody Thought We Were Crazy, Dennis Hopper, Brooke Hayward, and the 1960s Los Angeles. Mark Rozzo is a contributing editor at Vanity Fair. He has also written for the Los Angeles Times, the New Yorker, the New York Times, Esquire, Vogue, the Wall Street Journal, the Oxford American, the Washington Post, and many others. He teaches nonfiction at Columbia University. So this is a beautifully written, deeply researched book, and it will be on sale in the lobby following this event, where Mark Rozzo will gladly sign copies, right? I found reading it to be incredibly engrossing and stimulating, and I strongly encourage everyone to pick up a copy of their own. Now, Mark and I will discuss the book for about 45 minutes, and then take a few questions from the audience. Please welcome Mark Rozzo.
Thank you, Thad. Very nice to be here. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Oh, our pleasure, our pleasure. So I wanted to begin by asking you, I'm basically persuaded of the central, claim of this book, which was that this couple, Brooke Hayward and Dennis Hopper, were sort of central figures in a cultural historical tapestry in LA, in this kind of epic, this kind of golden era LA. But from a writer's perspective, I was curious as to how you looked at the project before you started to really write it, and I was wondering whether you found the kind of, it's haunted by the problem of it being a celebrity biography, right? So you have the celebrity biography, which to me would be attractive as a challenge to overcome, right? And then you also have, at least from a New Yorker's perspective, the problem of LA as a cultural, center. So how did you think about that?
I think I thought about it exactly as you just described it. That first of all, with Dennis, who would be the greater of the celebrities, at least in terms of notoriety of the two principal characters, who I agree with your description of them as being at the center of pretty much everything in LA in the '60s culturally. The challenge was to write about him. Not really as a celebrity, while also acknowledging, of course, his celebrity. I felt like I wanted to write a book that was a lot less about Hollywood than it was about Los Angeles during that time, with a wider cultural scope, which also reflected the interest of my characters. And I found that Dennis, somebody who's been written about a lot over the decades, but I feel like as a character, he was so often mythologized or misunderstood or reduced to a kind of Dennis was so crazy man, kind of, caricature really, and doing him a great disservice in many ways. I became very fascinated with Dennis as a creative person and wanted to write about him in that way. And in fact, as I got deeper into it, I began to see him as something of a holy fool for art. And I also thought, wow, that was really not an easy way to be in Hollywood in the 50s and 60s. To the question of Los Angeles, yes, very much on my mind. As you mentioned, I had been a writer at the LA Times. I wrote about books for the Los Angeles Times Book Review for many years. I would go out to LA frequently for the book festival there and to visit my editors. And I guess, this is late 90s, started in the late 90s. I really fell for the place hard, I had that zeal of the convert, I would say, about LA, which happens to a certain kind of East Coast person, which is what I am, and I would go out and I would be the kind of person who would accidentally on purpose drive past Brian Wilson's house in the rental car, or I would try to figure out where was the Ferris Gallery. I got very interested in Neutra architecture and wrote about that. So I had this interest in the cultural history of LA and very much a consciousness of the fact that LA cultural history, that phrase to the typical New Yorker was an oxymoron. And there's a lot of chip on the shoulder-ness about all of these things in LA. And being at the LA Times, I felt often like I was at the very, the sort of, the burbling, white-hot core of that feeling in Los Angeles. And even now, I have to say, jumping ahead to now, a lot of the response to the book from Los Angeles has been along those lines. I mean, this is a great city, as we know, but it still has this kind of inferiority complex. So I became, if that was a challenge, it would be to talk about the art and music and the filmmaking of Hollywood during this era, and to point up its cultural significance. So yeah, I saw those as challenges. As a book, I thought, I wanted to do a cultural history that was also a dual biography somehow. Mm-hmm. And that I didn't want to do a cradle to grave standard biography. But then within that, I realized I had to go back to the beginnings for my two characters and even their parents. So I ended up with this thing that spans about a century. And if it were charted on a graph, it was kind of like, it kind of looked like a brontosaurus in a way where, there might not be so much material in 1925 or 32 or 36 or 40 or 50, and then it starts to rise like this into the 60s, where so much of the material and action of the book takes place, and then it kind of goes down like this. I guess it's a brontosaurus, right? It's something like that.
Sine wave. Yeah, I mean, I think that when you hit your stride and you start to really focus on the couple, then it's really a portrait of a marriage. Yeah. It's at a month-to-month granularity. And I was thinking, this is crazy. And yet there was so much happening from 1961 to 1969 that it was almost, it was utterly justifiable that you were moving like that.
Yeah, well, the other challenge, of course, is writing about a marriage. That absolutely fascinated me. I think, Robert Pinsky had this line about marriages are complex and mysterious, and you have to approach them with a certain amount of tact. And I felt that way very much in trying to tell the story of Dennis and Brooke's highly improbable marriage. And then the other challenge there was that, unlike many biographical subjects who are a little bit more generous in terms of leaving a paper trail behind them, Brooke and Dennis did not write love letters, they did not keep diaries, they did not leave any of these papers stashed away in an attic or a storage facility in Century City or something like that. But what I did have as an important primary source, archival source, was Dennis's photographs. Mm-hmm. And
which are diaristic.
Which are very diaristic, even when they are, as they often are, about things that aren't Dennis, or Brooke. because he shot so many of the key personalities of the 1960s, shooting, 18,000 images during that span of time. And, I wanted to be able to transform this visual record of their life together into a written narrative.
And speaking of tact, maybe you could talk a bit about Brooke Hayward. She was the one to me, I had no idea who she was, really. But I came away feeling much more, well, not more sympathy for her, because it's a complex kind of, it's a folie à deux kind of experience with them.
Yeah.
But she struck me as the more admirable person, the kind of nobler one. And maybe you could just talk about where she came from, who she is, give some background.
Yeah, sure, I'd love to. And it's been very gratifying that so many readers have responded to this book with expressing to me how much they enjoyed reading about Brooke, and it sort of restored to her a central place in the relationship as, more than a muse, let's say, as a collaborator and a creative person in her own right. Brooke is best known for writing the 1977 memoir, Haywire, which was about her childhood growing up in Los Angeles and New York. One could say this was maybe the greatest Hollywood memoir ever written, and part of me feels that even calling it a Hollywood memoir is reducing it somehow. I mean, it's a highly original, idiosyncratic, gutsy work of nonfiction, and it is she, for lack of a better term, is, because she's still with us, a Hollywood royal as the daughter of the actress Margaret Sullivan, who you might know from Shop Around the Corner, other movies, Oscar-nominated actress, previously married to Henry Fonda, and her father was Leland Hayward, the producer, agent, maybe the first super agent really in Hollywood. He had clients like Katharine Hepburn and Jimmy Stewart and Ernest Hemingway, and so she came from this kind of gilded background, but in one single year, 1960, both her mother and her little sister died of barbiturate overdoses, presumptive suicides. There had been mental illness and depression in the family. Her little brother was sent away to Menninger. So her life growing up as a youngin was very much shadowed by tragedy in the family. And there's a famous line in Haywire when she is at her father's house, and it's after her sister has died, and she's looking out the window. This is up on Upper Fifth Avenue. And her friend Tom Mankiewicz of the Mankiewiczes says to her, well, you basically have the worst childhood that I've ever heard of. Your brother was sent away, your sister died, your mother died, this whole litany of horribleness. And Brooke could add to that at that point in 1960 that she was also, as a 23-year-old divorced with 2 children, he said something like, really your choice right now is just to either live or throw yourself out this window right now. And obviously she decided that she wanted to live. So I think the thing about Brooke that maybe you talk about as admirable is that there is this kind of strength inside her that's very steely. She's a very enigmatic and cool person, which is sort of the opposite of Dennis, who runs a little hot, let's say, and also deeply creative. She may have been a Hollywood royal, but she was also mischievous, rebellious, extremely intelligent, as was Dennis.
Yeah, I mean, I think of her, she had, her best friend was Jane Fonda. She grew up in that kind of milieu, and Jane had this completely different arc as an actress. She'd made all these films. She had no family in the 60s, and Brooke had this family as if she were trying to kind of ground herself and make this house
Yeah.
The book very much turns around this particular house they had in LA called, it was 1750 North Cedar or something?
1712 North Crescent Heights.
Crescent.
Yeah.
Maybe you could read a little about that. Do you have a passage you want to?
I have a passage, but it's not about
Oh,
1712.
it's not about, but it's about the house
I
that
read something
precedes it, yeah.
Yeah, so if it's okay, I wouldn't mind reading just the first 3 pages of the book. I don't know if I need to set it up, but this is 1961, and they've only been married for a few months. So maybe I'll read that, and then we can chat. In the fall of 1961, Brooke Hayward was coming down with a case of what she called the transcontinental blues. The air of Los Angeles turned brittle as the humidity level descended towards 0. The Santa Ana winds were rasping and harsh. A drought made the Santa Monica Mountains and Bel Air canyons tinder dry. It was the season, as Joan Didion would later write, of suicide and divorce and prickly dread. Pleased though she was about her recent Shoot for Life magazine and her first appearance in a feature film, Brooke felt like an exile. I missed the seasons, New York City, my apartment overlooking the planetarium, the theater, museums, friends, she recalled. In particular, she missed her father, who loathed LA almost as much as he loathed his daughter's new husband. He was enraged by the couple's move to the West Coast, just as he'd been by their hasty wedding in New York 3 months before. The tense emotional détente between father and daughter would endure for years. Brooke also missed her little sister. October 18th marked a full year since her death, and now the second anniversary of the death of her mother was approaching too. It was just around Halloween that her new husband vanished. Brooke called all over town, but no one had seen him, or if they had, they weren't telling. On the topic of marriage, he had once said, "I won't be easy to live with. I go off on strange tangents, why I might not even come home for 3 days." 3 days stretched to a week, and there's still no sign of him. It pained Brooke, sitting in their little rental house at the top of Stone Canyon Road in Bel Air, to admit to herself that her father had been right. This man was pure trouble. She decided to move back to New York with Jeffrey and Willie, her toddler sons from her first marriage, and write the second marriage off. It was a disaster. Her missing husband was Dennis Hopper, a fellow actor who'd become a teenage movie star in the 1950s after he'd appeared in Rebel Without a Cause and Giant. Dennis had a reputation for waywardness, and Brooke never would solve the mystery of his whereabouts that week. But one hot night in early November, under a moonless sky and with the Santa Anas whipping through the eucalyptus trees, Dennis slipped back into the house and got into bed next to Brooke. She pretended not to notice. She'd let him have it in the morning. Brooke never had the chance. That Monday morning, November 6th, a fire reared up in a patch of brush north of Mulholland Drive. Driven by 50-mile-an-hour gusts, the flames refused to be contained. Brooke was readying the boys for school when she saw a pair of fire trucks racing up Stone Canyon Road. While her husband slept, she watched the man across the street run out of his house and stand there, looking up toward Mulholland Drive through binoculars. He started loading his station wagon. Brooke shook Dennis awake. He opened his eyes to find a scene that was already tipping toward chaos. She, "I'll come back and get you." He, "We got to save something." Brooke hurried Jeffrey and Willie into the car for their daily ride to the John Thomas Dye School on Chelan Road. They would be safer there. Dennis grabbed a Milton Avery painting, a reclining nude that had belonged to Brooke's parents, off a wall, and as Brooke was about to pull out of the drive, threw it into the car. "I thought he was nuts," Brooke remembered. There was no time to save the Chinese tapestries that Dennis's father had given them, or the books, or the photo albums, or the toys. What ensued was a day of surreal hell scenes as the Bel Air fire came roaring down the canyon roads, Stradella, Roscommare, Stone Canyon, on its way to consuming more than 6,000 acres in the most destructive conflagration in the region's history. Burning shingles lofted through the air, picture windows crumbled, and carbonized patio furniture floated in swimming pools. Low-flying B-17s buzzed overhead in a rust-orange sky, dropping borate solution. Nearly every fire department in the city was dispatched to Bel Air as the flames climbed 50 feet and the fire jumped from house to house, road to road, canyon to canyon. It swept across Bel Air and Brentwood, incinerating everything in its path at a rate of 13 acres per minute, reaching as far west as Topanga Canyon. The fire department's official report described it as a hurricane of fire. The family's accounts of that traumatic morning are a Gordian knot of conflicting recollections, oft-told stories, and smeared impressions formed amid the calamity that was building on Stone Canyon Road. In the course of the day, Brooke drove through corridors of flame to retrieve the boys and return to Stone Canyon, while Dennis set out on foot, pulling obstinate neighbors out of their burning houses as he made his way down the hill towards Sunset Boulevard. When Brooke made it back to Stone Canyon, she found the scorched street closed to traffic. Her husband was nowhere in sight. In Nathaniel West's novel, The Day of the Locust, a painter toils day and night on an apocalyptic canvas called The Burning of Los Angeles. The Bel Air fire made that cataclysmic vision real. It was responsible for the most devastating property losses in California since the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, and it was responsible for the destruction of Brooke and Dennis's house at the top of Stone Canyon, among the first of nearly 500 houses to burn that day. If you were a believer in omens, it was not the most auspicious beginning for a marriage. But Brooke Hayward and Dennis Hopper, one an ingenue on the upswing and the other a self-sabotaging hard case, were soon to become, as one chronicler noted, the coolest kids in Hollywood.
Terrific. So they have this period after that where they are houseless and they stay with David O. Selznick.
They do.
And they see this kind of grand socializing of old Hollywood. And from that point on, they kind of move from the outer fringes of Bohemia to this, back to this ultra solid or seemingly solid Hollywood royalty world, black tie. And Dennis Hopper could clean up nice. I mean, I was amazed at how well behaved he sounded in those early days.
Yeah.
So this book is also a kind of portrait of houses, and they lose that first one fast, and then they get some kind of almost kind of training in terms of the vision of how to socialize or how to have people over with the Selznicks and so forth at Tower Grove.
Yeah.
And then they finally get this house where the most of the book is set.
Yes.
This is the North Crescent Drive house.
Yeah.
And in that house, Brooke has a big presence, right?
Oh, yeah.
She's given Dennis this Nikon camera. He's frenetic. He's shooting pictures all over, but she's collecting art. She's tiling the staircase and so forth.
Yeah.
But one of the things that hit me sort of slowly with this book is that it started to remind me, I don't know if many of you remember the book How I Became Hetty Jones, about do you know that?
Yeah.
It's about basically the beat movement from a woman's perspective. And this was kind of the 60s. The quiet portrait is of kind of a Brooke Hayward as this woman living in the 60s, but under 50s expectations, that she be a mother, that she nurture, that she tile the staircase and so forth. And that to me was very, had a lot of, I don't know, that was such a strong counterpoint to the frenetic Hopper, kind of hyperactive, art consuming. But she was with him too, so I just wondered if you could talk a bit about her, her actual role in the marriage in the 60s.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like when I got into the story of their marriage, I recognized that the 60s were really marked by these conflicting drives, really. There was, on the one hand, this macho renegade energy that you see suffusing the culture with rock and roll, and eventually in the counterculture as well, things like Easy Rider. I mean, Dennis, is par excellence, a sort of embodiment of that. And then against that, well, maybe not against it, let's say you also have the nascent, second wave feminism, post-feminine mystique. It's interesting how there are many occasions, I think, where those energies kind of like swirled together and made really incredible things. There are other times, at least in this relationship, they really ended up clashing. And also, when I talked to a lot of the amazing women who were friends of Brooks in the 60s, such as Jane Fonda, Toby Rafelson, who was married to Bob Rafelson, who was the director of 5 Easy Pieces and produced Easy Rider. He brought the Monkees to television, and it was basically Monkees' money that got Easy Rider done. Jill Sherry Robinson, who was the daughter of Dory Sherry, who then became a very accomplished memoirist and novelist. There are a few others. Josie Mankiewicz, most of all, who of course I didn't talk to because she died in 1974. But all of them were extremely talented, fairly privileged, and in talking to those of the ones that are still around, it was, they described how it was almost hard for them to see how feminism would impact them, because they had means and they had a certain amount of freedom. They didn't feel like they were being exploited, but yet they were all of those things. They were creative, they had agency, they were independent. And I certainly got very interested in exploring the women's side of the sexual revolution, which wasn't always a very even playing field, as Jane Fonda, told me, like, oh yeah, it was for the dudes.
The emancipated males.
Yes, and that's an actual quote. And Dennis was certainly the sort of person who would do whatever he wanted to do. So it was interesting exploring the relationship in that way, for sure.
Yeah. And they were also underemployed actors in the 60s, so they had a lot of time. They had a lot of time on their hands. They were doing kind of subpar TV work.
Yeah.
Dennis had been led to believe he was going to be a kind of James Dean leading man in the 50s. He had every reason to think that.
Yeah.
He was in Giant. He was a kind of prodigy.
Yeah.
And then it didn't pan out, and so he's doing kind of subpar works, and he's getting more and more convinced that he has to make a kind of countercultural film, and it's not happening.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really interesting when he started to see the true countercultural films of the mid to late 60s start to come out. He started to get more and more volatile, right? He's starting to fall apart. And some of the films that you cite, like The Graduate and Bonnie and Clyde, I hadn't really thought of them that way, because I remember seeing them. I was a kid, but I remember seeing them, and I didn't. But they definitely had a kind of a distinctive power as films.
Absolutely.
So, what was their role relative to Hollywood? Like the aesthetic model that they thought might work, Giant, and James Dean and so forth. How did that break apart for them? And did it break apart for Brooke? Was she as dissatisfied with the Hollywood studio narrative as Dennis?
Right. Well, I think they each of them had a very ambivalent relationship with Hollywood. For Brooke, I'll start there. It really came from her parents. Margaret Sullivan loathed Hollywood and wanted to break away from it. She wanted to go back to the stage. She did have these patrician pretensions, I would say, that Hollywood was grubby and she was above it. And Leland Hayward, as much as he was able to make total magic in putting projects together, had that attitude a little bit of himself, and his family, his father was a colonel in the Great War who had led the Harlem Hellfighters in Europe, and his grandfather had been a senator from Nebraska. I mean, they were very sort of East Coasty ultimately when Leland came around in that way. So Brooke, I feel, it inherited this very complex package of hang-ups about Hollywood. I think that she did want to act, but felt like it was maybe beneath her, and she would be competing with Margaret Sullivan, who might not be the household name to us now as she was, 50 or 60 or 70 years ago. I mean, Margaret Sullivan was really considered one of the great actresses in Hollywood at that time, an actress, as actress. Tennessee Williams papered his office with pictures of Margaret Sullivan. He couldn't, stop looking at her. Ogden Nash wrote a poem about her. Louise Brooks talked about Margaret Sullivan's voice, which sounded like falling snow. I can never get that sound of Margaret Sullivan's voice out of my ears. This is a person who raised Brooke. I mean, she grew up in a two-celebrity family in the 30s, 40s, 50s. And it was difficult for her to decide that she wanted to pursue this. Jane had that too, Jane Fonda, her best friend. The famous anecdote about Jane and Brooke, and again, I should really probably emphasize that the Fondas and the Haywards were almost like one family. I found an interview with Peter in Brooke's papers at the New York Public Library that she had accumulated in the writing of Haywire, where Peter said, yes, throughout my entire boyhood, I felt like a planet forever traveling between the two solar systems, that of the Fondas and that of the Haywards. There was a sibling relationship because Henry Fonda and Margaret Sullivan had been married before Margaret married Leland Hayward. And they would all hang out together. And the kids would love to just watch the parents and try to write these narratives that were under the surface of their parents' behavior. Like, are Margaret and Hank still in love? They love having these conversations, conjecturing that their parents still had a thing going on. And when Margaret, Maggie, and Hank got together, they did have this rapport. They would do cartwheels together on the lawn, and there was all this intrigue. But one day in the mid-50s, I think around 56-ish, 55, I think, actually, Brooke and Jane were together in LA. It was a summer break, and David O. Selznick was driving them around in his car, which is something that would happen if you were Brooke Hayward and Jane Fonda. And I'm not sure what the context of the conversation was, but it led to this line, which neither one of them would be able to forget for the rest of their lives. David O. Selznick, producer of Gone with the Wind, says, Brooke will be the movie star, not Jane. Maybe this is David O. Selznick's unerring, antennae being a bit askew that day, but it also gives some insight into maybe what the expectations were for the two girls when they were young teenagers. And also says something about Brooke's a kind of natural beauty and mystery and charisma. It was unusual. Margaret Sullivan's beauty really proceeded not from, she wasn't Carole Lombard. She had a crooked tooth and a weird nose. It was really her personality, her intelligence, her sass. She was known for a steely wit. These are all things that Brooke had inherited. And she married early in that sort of 1950s way as an undergraduate. She was pregnant. Her husband was Michael Thomas, who some people here might be familiar with, who later became a satiric novelist. At the time, in the mid-50s, he was studying to be a curator. He was doing art history at Yale with people like Henry Geldzahler. She kind of squashed down this ambition to be an actress. Her real ambition always had been to be a writer. In fact, she had basically sold a novel as a 12-year-old to a big New York publisher, but her mother ordered her to put it aside because she was too young and people would only think of her as being Margaret Sullivan's daughter. I mean, can you imagine? So that all went away. But she, one day in this marriage, which was not very happy, she started feeling out acting and modeling, and she went into town, this is 1959, for a modeling appointment. It was for Vogue. It was Horst, P. Horst was the photographer, and she came back home that night, and she had had the cover of Vogue. And for some crazy reason, she was accepted into the actor's studio. And she cross-examined Lee Strasberg, like, are you only accepting me because Margaret Sullivan is my mother? She was always extremely conscious of that. And he said, well, no, but your mother was a fabulous actress, and maybe there's something there, but I also think you're good. Her husband was not at all supportive of this, adding to Brooke's difficulties. But that marriage ended up ending in part because Brooke got this bug to actually go out there and start doing things, and started getting roles off Broadway, television, a movie called Mad Dog Call. It all kind of started to progress for her in this way.
So she broke up with this first husband because he was resentful about her having a career, but with Hopper, she seemed to be free again, yet she had a child, she had 3 children to take care of, and so in practice, she wasn't that free to actually take work. I had no idea, had this early sensitive James Dean period where he was incredible in The Giant and in Rebel Without a Cause. He seemed to have been really, unfortunately, took to heart this biography of Barrymore, John Barrymore he read, where the biography really made the case for great acting, greatness, and unmanageability. So if you're difficult, it kind of goes with being great. And the impression I came away with was that left such a mark on him that he felt like he had a kind of license to be a difficult artist, a difficult actor, and it blew up in his face with this one early work with Henry Hathaway, is it?
Yes, that's right, From Hell to Texas. But yeah, I mean, Dennis's background was very much not gilded or privileged in any way. I mean, he was this upstart kid from Dodge City, Kansas, from a very working class, middle class family. They moved to the San Francisco suburbs around 1948, 1949, when Dennis was about to turn 13. And they lived in these scrubby suburbs out there. And Dennis, out of nowhere, decided that he wanted to act. And, his mother had asked him for his 13th birthday, like, oh, I thought I might get you a sleeping bag, for your scout campouts. And Dennis said, no, I actually want dramatic lessons. She thought, okay, this is a little weird, but okay. They found a woman from the San Diego Opera named Lee Whitney, who was his teacher, and within about 6 months, he told Marjorie Hopper, Mrs. Hopper, I think he's teaching me now. Dennis became a bit of an acting prodigy. I mean, he was extremely precocious, talented, a Shakespearean actor, as a matter of fact. As a teen, he was acting a lot at the Globe Theater in San Diego, and that's how he was discovered by Dorothy McGuire and her husband, the photographer John Swope, and went to Hollywood. And within 6 days after appearing on this show called Medic, in which he played an epileptic, he got that part by talking to a professor at UCLA about what a fit, actually, a seizure looks like. And he went to the casting office, and instead of waiting his turn to go in to read his sides or whatever it was, he just has a seizure in the waiting room, and everybody thinks it's real. And it's one of these, like, kid, you got the part things. So this airs on, I think it was CBS, and within a few days, he was signed to Warner Brothers. This was after, I guess it was Columbia Pictures, right? Where he told the president of that company to go F himself, let's say, in that meeting. It didn't go well. But you're right, he did, Dennis was really, he hoovered up everything from, the Boleslavsky acting stuff, which was all about, like, if you want to be an actor, you've got to know the paintings, you need to know the poets, you need to know the music, you need to know everything. He was immersed from a pretty young age in all things creative. I mean, he really was a young, beatnik out of Dodge City. He liked to paint, he liked to write. When the 50s came around, of course, like many people in his generation, was very impacted by the Beats. And then, as you mentioned, that Barrymore book by Fowler, it's so purple, but it's all about, like, deranging your senses, and Barrymore was a mess, and Dennis thought, well, that must really be the way to go. But the impact of the friendship and doing 2 pictures with James Dean was really profound, because that kind of ratified, I think, Dennis's sense of, like, oh, I want to be an artist, I want to be creative. Because Dean also had this polyglot way about him. He listened to jazz, he played bongos. Natalie Wood said, you know, he can talk to James Dean about anything from contemporary design to how to fix a carburetor. You know, Dean loved photography. And very much unlike Dennis, you know, he was a method actor. So all the method stuff that Dennis picked up, that was through the relationship with Dean, because it was so utterly unlike anything in his own preparation as an actor. Improv, sense memory, what is this? You know, it is all method acting 101, but this was totally news coming from outer space for Dennis Hopper as a 18, 19-year-old in Hollywood.
And it was interesting, during the houseless moment when they were hanging out with the older Hollywood set, I guess he wasn't necessarily that much older. Vincent Price told Hopper, you're going to be a villain, not a leading James Dean kind of actor. And then Hopper's like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
But it was prophetic, right?
It was prophetic, yes.
And we know him, or I know him, primarily as this sort of blue velvet villain.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, that is true. Vincent Price was somebody that Dennis first encountered in San Diego at the Globe, and a good friend of his was living on Vincent Price's property. And Vincent Price was probably the most prominent art collector in Hollywood circles from the late 40s through the 50s. A lot of Diebenkorns and you know, that kind of the cutting edge art of that time, and mixed with a lot of crazy objects, you know, Olmec statues and things like this. Dennis loved this house, and the family stayed there for a night after the Bel Air fire. And in the book I write about how you know, this house really had an influence on Dennis and Brooke in the creation of 1712. Which was the house they bought in early 1963 that was a Spanish colonial up in the hills above the Chateau Marmont. I mean, not the most unusual house for LA. It looks like so many others, a Spanish colonial from the 20s designed by an architect called P. Brainerd Hale, who was said to have had 11 children and a wooden leg, and at some point absconded to Mexico with a burlesque dancer and was never heard from again. You know, not exactly like a Rudolph Schindler character. Then they bought this house, and that did become, as I write in the book, the de facto living room of 1960s Los Angeles. And they packed this place to the rafters with pop art and all these crazy objects that Brooke liked to collect, and day and night, week to week, month to month, year to year, you just never knew who was going to be showing up in this house. They had old Hollywood, new Hollywood, the Ferris Gallery artists, the Warhol gang, Ike and Tina Turner, Joan Didion, Terry Southern, the occasional Black Panther, Hell's Angels sleepover, 20 of them in sleeping bags in the living room floor. Just this incredibly rich, almost a kind of life as art installation piece really was their house, which also happened to be a family house, because as you mentioned, there were 3 little kids living in it. You know, it wasn't a museum.
When Dennis starts to go off the rails toward the end, when he's drinking and drugging so much, that was when I started to remember the 60s from the perspective of a boy. I was like, kind of found it menacing. You know, I didn't love it. My younger brother totally loved the kind of anarchy of the 60s and the political anarchy of it. But I found it kind of scary. And I remember, you know, people like Hopper with the big, you know, Pancho Villa mustache, that kind of mas macho 60s guy.
Yeah.
I didn't like it. And that was the reaction of the kids, banging on the door. Well, when the marriages started to break apart, the kids start to become more prominent in the narrative.
They do,
and you start to feel the romance of all of this diminish.
Yes.
And you feel the kind of the price is starting to kind of what's accruing as a kind of you know, the consequences of all this excess and all this ambition on the part of it, frustrated ambition And it gets very ugly at the end, right?
Yeah.
It's not pretty, and it's only 7 years, but it's such an intense 7 years. It's burning at both ends. It's phenomenal.
Yeah, and you know, not only did I come to feel like Dennis and Brooke were the emblematic couple of LA in the 60s, so many ways. They were kind of like the Gerald and Sarah Murphy of their time, Gerald and Sarah Murphy being the famous expat couple who inspired Fitzgerald's Tender as the Night and seemed to connect everything in 1920s France. You know, Brooke and Dennis kind of served that same function in LA, where they knew all the artists, they knew all the musicians, they knew the new Hollywood, they knew the old Hollywood. They could just cross every social border, and also, you know, I know we've barely talked about the art, but you know, they provided really crucial early support to a number of artists who now we know from museums and galleries around the world, from Andy Warhol to Ed Ruscha to
I was surprised
Roy
at how Ed
Lichtenstein.
Ruscha was thinking, like, I'm not sure this is going to work for me. You know, he was making paintings, and they would sell maybe to Brooke, and you would think, well, maybe I'll make a go at this after all. But it was very hit and miss or touch and go.
Well, it was. I mean, if you're a young artist at the time,
especially in LA,
it always is. In LA, I mean, rent is a little bit cheaper there. That's why a lot of the artists are there instead of New York City, really. But yeah, these were like real leg up purchases that they made. They really stuck their necks out for this new kind of art that a lot of the world just saw as insignificant or even stupid, honestly. And when, you know, they bought the first Warhol soup can painting, Tomato, by the way, which is a pretty good choice. You know, there's a big asterisk there because, of course, in the Ferris Gallery show in July of '62, which was Warhol's first show as a fine artist, the 32 Campbell soup can paintings, Irving Blum, the director of the gallery, finds that there's not a lot of interest in these soup cans. He can't sell them. You know, he has 5 buyers, the first one being Dennis, who earmarked Tomato. So Irving decides that he wants to keep the 32 soup can paintings together and has, you know, this tricky feat of diplomacy ahead of him where he has to convince all the buyers to withdraw, you know, the sales. And he manages to do that because he's quite a salesman, and he keeps these things together and sends Warhol $1,000 in $100 installments to keep the 32 soup can paintings together, which then, you know, fast forward to 1996, and he forks them over to MoMA in a combined gift and sale of $15 million, which is about like $500,000.
It's funny because I've heard this Ferris Gallery story a million times, but this is why I love biography, is because I don't feel like it had the sort of lived reality until this narration of it for me. I mean, it was through identifying with Brooke and Dennis and the way they were almost single-handedly keeping this whole pop art thing going. Suddenly I got how dependent Warhol and Lichtenstein and company were on this little foothold they had. It was really, really huge. And of course, this is a canonical. I'm just kind of saying that it came to life for me in a way that it hadn't previously.
That's
and,
great.
Yeah.
I mean, Dennis and Brooke, I should say.
We want to leave a little time for questions.
Oh yeah, sure.
Questions.
Okay, questions.
Anyone? There are mics
As
there
we
on the
keep talking.
side. You don't even need a mic in this room, actually. You can just stand up and exclaim.
Yeah. While we're waiting for a question, I would say that Dennis and Brooke did get that Campbell soup can painting when Dennis walked into a competing gallery, Virginia Dwan's gallery in Westwood, to go talk to this guy, John Weber, and he walks in, and there's a Campbell soup painting on the wall, and he can't believe it because he thought all 32 were at Ferris. Warhol had done like a one-off, and he just says to Weber, "Oh, can I get that one?" And it's like, "Yeah, sure." I think that was $75.
Yeah.
Yeah, which was not cheap, you know, at the time, but thinking about it now, of course, it's mind-boggling. So they did get it, you know, in the end.
What I had forgotten about the whole soup can thing was that Warhol did the whole 32 or whatever, like asparagus, and it was this conceptual completion. It was a set, and that it wasn't his idea either. That was also striking. It was he was hanging out with a woman who was like an interior designer or something.
Yeah.
And he was anxious about Lichtenstein getting the jump on him with regard to this work. And she said, well, you should do money, or do soup cans, and do this whole set. And there was a way in which he was, I mean, I just hadn't realized how the idea for it was someone else's.
Yeah,
You're doubting this now.
No, it's true.
Remember
But he really jumped on it. It was the money was the idea that the friend had, and actually I think charged him some money for that. And then she tossed in a second idea for free, which was Campbell's soup cans. And he thought, oh, this is great. Like I eat this stuff all the time. I mean, who doesn't at the time? I mean, Dennis and Brooke had it in their pantry. But for Dennis, what was significant about pop art was that he grew up very much in this Abex moment and wanted to be a painter. After they lost that house in the fire and they wanted to rebuild their lives around art at 1712 and collect art, they weren't really sure what to do. The abstract expressionism stuff was starting to feel a little tired. They were thinking there might be some figurative painting coming in from San Francisco. Should we buy that? One day, Dennis actually went to see Irving at Ferris Gallery, and Irving said, "Hey, come back here for a second. I got to show you something." They walked back to the back office at Ferris. There's a little Formica table. It's got some transparencies there, and he shows Dennis two things. One was a Lichtenstein cartoon painting. The other was a Campbell soup can painting, because Irving had just come back from New York and seen this stuff, and he was trying to convince them to come out to L.A. When Dennis sees this, he apparently jumps in the air to Irving's astonishment and says, "That's it, that's it." And Irving says, "What's it? What?" He says, "That's it. That's the return to reality." He's been waiting for this return to reality, meaning that painting would take on, in the parlance of the day, you would say, common objects, and be representational or figurative or something like this, and it just blows his mind. And Dennis, in his own work as an artist, had been moving away from these globby canvases to then, of course, photography, and doing these weird photo assemblage things, which he showed showed well, actually, for a while in Los Angeles with great reviews in Art Forum, and then it just it didn't continue. And this is almost coming back around to the first question that you asked about the challenge. I think with what's so fascinating to me and challenging about Dennis is just the disconnects of Dennis. Here's a guy who could have one of his photographs on the cover of Art Forum magazine at the same time that he was going to shoot Petticoat Junction.
Right.
And maybe to extend that out, the timeline of that observation, here's the guy who took what Walter Hopps thought was the greatest photograph ever taken of Andy Warhol, who's also Frank Booth in Blue Velvet, So who is this person?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's related to that, that's why I'm
Okay.
one of the threads you followed so nicely in the book is this culmination in Dennis's career of actually being an easy rider, another huge cultural milestone of the 60s. And I think it does kind of emerge from his photography and so on. But maybe you could talk a little bit about that, just where you feel that came from, what he was trying to do, why that remarkable movie happened when it did.
Well, I mean, that was, there's so many threads there. I thought, well, first of all, I was so fascinated by Easy Rider because it's a movie that has been dissected, analyzed, subject to an almost biblical level of exegesis for generations. That's on one hand. On another hand, it's often very blithely dismissed as a period piece, as a relic, as a curiosity. That drew me to it. I feel like in writing the narrative, I was able to see so many of the strains of Dennis's creative life and how they ultimately ended up entwining in interesting ways in Easy Rider, from the art films of Andy Warhol and of Bruce Conner, maybe more directly, to experiences that Dennis had on set with directors such as Curtis Harrington, making an art film called Night Tide in 1960. Roger Corman, a great influence, somebody who was able to take exploitation and genre films but inject them with a little social relevance, I felt very much like there was the Duchampian ideal, which is extremely important to Dennis. I mean, lost track of how many times people kind of told me that Dennis said to them the Duchamp line of, in the future, the artist will point at something and that will be art. So there's this kind of found object of the biker film that then he kind of hot rods into this new thing. I think what's significant about Easy Rider is that it is really the first movie of its time to look the counterculture directly in the eye, to speak its language, to critique it even from the inside. And that impulse for Dennis came from, so many ways that Dennis was involved in that world. Let's say The Human Being in January of 1967. Dennis goes to this. He's among a crowd of 20,000, 40,000, some have even said 80,000 people in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. They're young people mostly, listening to Allen Ginsberg, listening to Timothy Leary, listening to Dizzy Gillespie play the trumpet, listening to the Grateful Dead, Gary Snyder. It's a psychedelic picnic. And Dennis at that moment was looking around thinking, wow, I work in Hollywood. Who's speaking to this crowd? Nobody. How do we reach these people? How do we speak their language? How do we speak their language in a way that's not hectoring or lecturing or insulting or dumb? And young people in the 60s were moving away from the movies. They were interested in music more and in LSD more, frankly. And they weren't that interested in going to see Dr. Dolittle and Sound of Music. So Dennis really set for himself this challenge of trying to communicate to that audience in film. And Easy Rider was the film that did it. And so, and not only that, it created a new kind of Hollywood math. This is a movie that was made for less than half $500,000 and made something like $30 million. It was a weirdo art film made by a group of stoners that wasn't supposed to do anything, that became a box office juggernaut. And through that, of course, is so emblematic of the time. I feel like it's forever fixed in our consciousness of the summer of 1969 with the moon landings and the Manson murders and Woodstock and the Beatles walking across Abbey Road. That's Easy Rider. And of course, for Dennis, it transformed his life utterly. But
it was made right on the threshold of the divorce. And but this is why I also came to admire her more. She was able to watch the outtakes and say, he's so good, he's so talented, and not have that appreciation of his gifts tainted by the breakup. I thought that was really amazing. But I was also amazed by how fast that movie came together, given how long he had struggled to get the backing and to get everything to fall into place. And then it was like, I was like, that's it? It happened like in a matter of weeks almost. It was crazy.
Yeah, well, the editing went on forever. David Hopper, who is Dennis's little brother who talked to me a lot, and in fact, when I was talking to David, because Dennis died in 2010, that's when I felt closest to Dennis, actually, was with David, and David said, I was asking about the longer cut, which was something like 4 hours, because Dennis just could not lose all these beautiful landscape shots that Laszlo Kovacs, filmed as the DP, the cinematographer. And David said, oh yeah, that was like a New Testament. And the finished version was like a pop song. So from 4 hours down to 90. I asked Brooke, well, what did you think? She said, I like the shorter version, which I think is probably true of many people. But when you were talking about Bonnie and Clyde, The Graduate, this sort of beginning of, let's say, auteurship in Hollywood in the 60s, Dennis, had this movie he wanted to make called The Last Movie. He started working that in 1965, and that was really up and down and all around. It was this film within a film. It was a Western being shot in a town, and then the crew, they all leave and go back to Hollywood, and what happens in the town after Hollywood leaves. Stuart Stern, who wrote Rebel Without a Cause, wrote the script. He had people lined up like Roddy McDowall, Jason Robards, Jane Fonda, I think, all of his buddies to be in this movie. It was really getting a lot of Hollywood attention and buzz. There was excitement brewing about this project that arguably would have been the first auteur movie coming out of Hollywood with Dennis as the director. It hit a wall. in 1966 through various reasons having to do with financing. And what Brooke said then, if the last movie had been made then, Dennis would never have fallen into the abyss. Mm-hmm. So he really had this chip on his shoulder about trying so hard to create something in Hollywood.
And also maybe being as, weary of promoting so many other people's work. Like he was a collector and he was a kind of enthusiast on behalf of so many artists. And there was a sense in which he's like, well, what about me?
Yeah,
what about my moment of glory?
There could be. It's funny. I'm not sure if Dennis would react that way. And certainly, the Ferris Gallery artists felt like he was one of their own. I mean, photography was really his medium. Mm-hmm. I mean, he was the guy who was taking pictures of all the artists and doing all the gallery announcements. That was like that ultimately became his art, at the time. He felt very much in it. But I do think, yes, it was very difficult for Dennis to be hanging around with Ed Ruscha or Andy Warhol or Jasper Johns or Peter Blake or all these people, David Hockney, and then, as I said before, showing up and doing, Petticoat Junction or Combat.
And also film as the kind of the total art. He was so well suited to bring all of those threads together, which is kind of what you were getting at with. And you do a great job of describing how it's this catalog of influences contained in Easy Rider. It's just terrific. Yes, this will have to be the last question. We've kind of overrun already.
What has happened to all the artwork, the collections, and even the house after his death?
Yeah. Well, the art, Dennis always liked to say that Brooke got all the art when they divorced 68, 69. They separated in 68, divorced in 69. Like a lot of things Dennis said, that was like partly true, partly fiction. He did keep certain things like this, maybe the last work that Duchamp did, which is too long of a story to get into now. But Brooke, since a lot of their collecting was done care of her checkbook, she ended up with these pieces, and which we haven't really talked about, but we're talking about Ed Ruscha's Standard Station, Amarillo, Texas, 1963, Lichtenstein's Sinking Sun, Frank Stella's Tetuan 3, Andy Warhol's soup can painting, Double Mona Lisa. I mean, there were works in there by Rauschenberg, by John McCracken, by Billy Al Bankston, by Larry Bell, one of the early Lucite cubes. 1712 North Crescent Heights was as avant-garde as any gallery in the entire world in the 1960s. It was known as the Prado of pop. And it was also, as Thad was saying, it was a place where, these people would come and see this work in a very intimate setting. And so in that intimate way, the circle of recognition of this art would kind of expand, which was fascinating to me as well. In the 70s, Brooke sold most of it back via Irving Blum and Joe Hellman, and got what were considered pretty good prices at that time. We're talking thousands, let's say. But who would know? When you spend $75 on a Campbell soup painting in 1962, nobody's tapping you to be a prescient, genius investor in art. I mean, you're not really buying art for that reason in the 60s. You're buying it because you love it and because you think it's culturally significant. And it turned out that that Dennis and Brooke had really the right instinct, with a lot of this. So anyway, a lot of these works are in museums and galleries. I couldn't tell you where every single one is, but I could say that the Standard Station Amarillo, Texas painting, which is that like 11 or 12 feet across, which little Marin Hopper, their daughter, learned to hula hoop under, or the Lichtenstein Sinking Sun painting, which is similarly ginormous, a cartoon sunset, very Californian subject. The two boys, Jeffrey and Willie, told me about some fight they had in the living room one day, and one of them chucked a piece of toast across the room, and it ricocheted off of that Lichtenstein painting, left a butter stain on it. They were just living with all this stuff. Those two paintings each now would probably be worth, 50 to 60 million or more, probably. Yeah. So, c'est la vie, right?
Okay. Get my mind around it. Well, that was terrific. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.